trying to get this to. Hi, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. We're back for another lesson in our continuation of the Sunday school class at Jerome United Methodist Church. I started with a little bit different there. This is on the emergence of David. He's not yet king. He becomes king in the next class. But it's got a little bit of poignant history for me there. When I was in the 4th grade in the children's choir at our church in Huntington, West Virginia, and periodically, a couple times a year, they would do musical programs of about a half an hour and 40 minutes for the church on like a Wednesday evening or something. I can't remember the details. And so early in my time in that, we had the 4th grade boys stand up, and I was a small man, and they picked me to be David. So that's the song they sang to me. The pastor and his wife were both very tall. Their second son was the largest guy in the class in any of the youth, so he became Goliath. Jim Bird, real nice guy. And so they sang me that song. I sang a song back to Goliath, which I will not foist upon you all. I have more sympathy for you than that, even though I remember the words pretty much. And I had the sling and got him and cut off the head. I didn't actually cut his head off, but pretended to cut off his head with the sword. So it's an interesting segment. It has takes me back to 4th grade. I was just turning 9 when all this was going on. This is a long time ago. And it's interesting that I can still remember the song I sang to him, but again, I'm going to spare you that. This is the emergence of David. David is a very, very interesting personality. Clearly the greatest king of Israelite history. He was able to build a small to mid-sized empire encompassing most of what is the Israel and West Bank now. He conquered up into Syria, across the Jordan. This is in later time, but he was an interesting, very charismatic figure. And is typical in this part of the Old Testament that you have three competing stories about how he gets picked by God and therefore by the people to be this great leader. The first one is from the Samuel tradition. If you remember back, I'm certain you remember everything we talked about in the previous lesson, which was actually 2 weeks ago, that how Samuel, there were 3 different methods on how Samuel chose King Saul. And the first one was just picking him up on an anointment, and then they were casting lots on the other one, etc. And so the first lesson, the first description of how they picked him is simply from the Samuel tradition, that Samuel got this message from God to go to Bethlehem and look at the sons of Jesse, that God had decided to abandon King Saul, and he'd found a new king among the children of the sons of Jesse who lived in Bethlehem. And Samuel goes and he interviews them one by one, and God tells him, no, not this one, no, not this one. He runs out of sons. And he says to Jesse, well, do you have any more? He said, yeah, I have the youngest. He's out taking care of the sheep now. So they bring him in, and he has ruddy cheeks and fine eyes and very handsome. And God tells Samuel, this is the one, so Samuel anoints him. Now, this is the least believable of any of the stories as to how it would happen in that differential when he's just a lad, probably 12, 13, 14, somewhere in that range. The second one is a interesting story which has a lot of believability to it. And that's that King Saul is sliding into some form of mental disorder. It's impossible for me, even as much as I like to diagnose mental disorders in my patients, because it's really rampant, to figure this one out. Could be type 1 bipolar, which you get these rages up high and way down low. It sounds like that, but you can't be certain. But Saul is troubled because Saul knows that God has abandoned him. God has chosen him to be king and has abandoned him for somebody else. And I don't blame him for having rages. You think, hey, I did the best I could. All you can do is the best you can. And I've been abandoned, and God's going to find somebody else. So that they are looking for an excellent musician to soothe his shattered nerves. And David played a harp. Now, nobody knows exactly what that harp is. Probably a much more basic version, similar to our auto harp. But I don't really know. A lot of these things are just speculative at this point. And so David is identified as a very young man from one of the youngest son of Jesse from Bethlehem, and they bring him into the rudimentary court that Saul has, and he would play music for him and soothe his troubled soul. But again, David is described as handsome, charming, it's musically talented. And the description that comes up from him is he's really mesmerizing as a personality. Now, there are certain people who are able to mesmerize other people. And some of these are performers, some of these are business leaders. Several of them are political leaders that are able to mesmerize their followers, that they can do nothing wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And people don't see that they're getting swept along in this. Some politicians aren't mesmerizing, some are. So it's a very interesting talent that he has. And even as Saul is soothed by this, he senses the threat from David. Now, if you're an Oriental king in that area, you have a lot of threats to you. Your most immediate threat, of course, are your male family members. Your sons, remember it's David's son Absalom who revolts against him, or your brothers. The recent coup attempt in Jordan, it was the half-brother of the current king that was involved in this attempt. Or your generals, the best example of that I can think of in recent times was the old Shah of Iran's father had been a general, and he overthrew the ongoing Shah about the 1930s and proclaimed himself Shah, and that led to the next Shah. And if you were around in 1979, like I was, you remember the overthrow of the Shah of Iran by the Khomeini group. And then you rarely had people rise up from the lower groups and take over. Most revolutionary leaders are actually from the upper classes. In our revolution, Washington and John Hancock were the two wealthiest men in the colonies who led the revolution. Castro came from a higher up Cuban family, Havana family. Osama bin Laden was the son of the wealthiest man in Yemen. So most leaderships come not from down in the peasant class like David did, but from the upper classes, and they displace it. So you have to be careful if you're a monarch. And the easiest way to displace you, of course, was to kill you. So you got to be very careful with your personal safety. So that's the second story, how it comes in. He's brought in to soothe him with a musical thing. And that's a very believable story because it brings him inside the court where his good looks and charm and all that are able to win friends and end up marrying Saul's daughter, etc. The third story is the more popular one and the most romantic, and the one that I was playing that part in. And this is the David and Goliath story. Now, it's a little bit conflicted because in 2 Samuel, chapter 21, verse 19, a different person named Elhanan, is identified as killing Goliath. So there's a little bit of conflict there. My suspicion is that there were two stories that got conflated a little bit. That I think that the story of David fighting the champion of the Philistines is quite believable because people did that in the ancient days. They would try to settle disputes between clans or tribes by a battle between the champion of each one. So it's not outside the history of warfare at that time. So the third story is that, again, David is the youngest son, and he's minding the sheep at home, and his three older brothers, I forget the names, are in Saul's army. Remember, Saul didn't have a standing professional army like David did later. He had basically called up the reserves from the various tribes, and they would supply his manpower. So it wasn't a terribly trained army. And they are, his brothers are serving, and his father says, get some barley and grain together and get some supplies and take them to your brothers. So the brothers are not happy to see, what are you doing here? Who's minding the sheep? He said, I got someone else to mind the sheep. And so he's there, and for each day recently Goliath had been coming out and trash talking the Hebrews, and then challenging them to send someone out to kill him, try to kill him, and he'll fight him one-on-one. Now, Goliath is described as 6 cubits tall in a span. Now, remember, a cubit is 18 inches in modern thing. That's from the tip of your finger to the end of your elbow. That's a cubit. Remember, they would use human dimensions to make measurements because that's all they had. And a span is this, from your widespread thumb to your widespread finger, which is about 9 inches. So according to that, he was 9.5 feet tall, which I find difficult to believe. They may have exaggerated out of fear. That's a huge person. If you remember the old French wrestler and movie actor, Andre the Giant, Andre was about 7'4" and weighed 500 pounds. He had an appetite along with his size. He could, famous for drinking 150 cans of beer in one setting, stuff like that. No wonder he weighed 500 pounds and only lived to be 40. But so I'm certain Goliath was, as a giant, it probably had acromegaly like Andre did from a pituitary tumor, but he probably didn't make it to 9.5 feet tall. That's massive. And he had a spear that weighed 15 pounds, and he had armor that weighed 90-some pounds. And he's out there trash talking and challenging them to come out and fight him. And David is this youth, so probably 14 or 15, ruddy-cheeked, handsome, fine eyes again. And he's there watching. He says, well, why didn't somebody fight him? I'll fight him. And they say, you're crazy. You can't do this. But people tell Saul, and so Saul comes over, or David goes to Saul or something, and he says, you're just a lad. Depending on how you translate the word, a boy, a lad. And he said, but I can fight him. So he says, well, okay. I used to have to protect the sheep, and the lions would come up and grab the sheep, and I'd take them out of the mouth and kill the lion, or do the same thing if a bear gets the sheep. So I can do this. And so he says, okay, well, here, put my armor on. Well, Saul puts his armor on this teenager, and it's way too heavy, and he can't even move, so he just takes it off and leaves it. And then he goes out with a stick, walking staff, and he and Goliath start trash talking. We do it now in athletic events, and they did it in wartime then. I'm going to do this to you, and I'm going to know God's going to protect me. I'm going to do that to you, blah, blah, blah. And then the Goliath starts coming forward. David runs forward, takes his sling. Remember, this is a couple of leather straps with a leather sack to hold the stone in. You put a big stone in there, and you hold it, you sling it or twirl it around, and then you let go of one of the straps, and the stone hits Goliath in the forehead, knocks him out. Probably doesn't kill him, could have killed him, but knocks him out, and he goes kaplunk. So David didn't have a sword or anything like that. He goes over, takes Goliath's sword, and finishes him. Probably, I would suspect, this way. I know this is gross, but warfare is gross anyway, and that man-on-man warfare was really gross, and cuts his head off. That finished it, that's for sure. Whether you survive the stabbing, taking your head cut off, that'll finish it. Takes the head back as a trophy, back to Saul. And so it's a fascinating story. Could this have happened? Sure. So this has believability to it also. Which one is the accurate, whether it's this one or whether it's the playing the harp, I can't tell. It doesn't matter. It's a fantastic story. And it shows the emergence of this person as a great leader, as a great Hebrew, and it's a great challenge to Saul. So Saul's delighted to have the Philistines dead, and the Philistines retreat, and the Hebrews chase them and sack their camp and kill a bunch of them. David gets to keep Saul's weapons as booty. When you killed someone in personal combat like that, you got to keep their weapons as your prize. And David is invited in to join the household. And he's brought into Saul's household, and Saul's getting more and more jealous because he's walking by and the women are praising Saul has killed thousands of Philistines and David has killed tens of thousands. That really does Saul's mood a lot of good. And he's sensing this person rising up who's a challenge to him, because David was a challenge to him. Again, he's handsome, he's mesmerizing, he's got musical talent, and he's able to inspire incredible loyalty even in Saul's family. So Saul's oldest son, Jonathan, is taken with David, just adores him. Mesmerized is a good term. And then there's the discussion what they're going to do, because Saul going to give him as a prize for having killed Goliath and slain the war. And so people tell him to ask for one of Saul's daughters as a wife, so you can become the son-in-law of the king. Now that actually puts him even more of a threat, because if he's inside the royal family, then he's even more of a threat. So Saul thinks, okay, I'll get rid of him. I'll tell him the daughter has fallen in love with David. Like I said, this guy was mesmerizing. I'm not in the least bit mesmerizing. I know that. So I have more jealousy than anything else about this, but it can be a bit of a curse, I suspect, also. And so she falls in love with him, and she clearly wants to marry him, but it's all Saul's decision. So David says, I don't have any possessions for a bride price. I was laughing with my wife this evening about this, because when we got married, I didn't have any money for a bride price either. So I'm glad they didn't have them in those days. Karen was glad too, because she knows what this bride price is. So Saul thinks, well, I'll get David killed by the Philistines, because the bride price is 100 Philistine foreskins, which of course are not going to be circumcised, so they can tell them from. So, because thinking I'll send him out and he'll get killed. So David takes his men. He had already been appointed to an army leadership position inside Saul's court at this time to go off and fight the various enemies. So he takes his men out, and they go out and kill 200 Philistines and bring the foreskins in. I know this sounds gross, but this is what's in there. I didn't write this, okay? So I'm just reporting on it. So they bring that in. They don't understand it, explain it in any detail. So he ends up marrying this one. And she adores him. And Saul is getting more and more concerned about him, more and more jealous. Because Saul's, God's abandoned him and swung it over to David. So there's a great scene, which is my other favorite scene in here, going back to my primary school, back in the 4th grade. We used to have in primary church, they have those little single fold sheets, and they'd be a picture on the front and a little bit of a lesson. It was actually very nice for 4th graders. You could read basic stuff. And the only one I remember was the picture of Saul, which is in the thing we're here now. David's playing the harp, and Saul's taking his spear and throws it at David, trying to pin him to the wall. And David dodges and runs away. And that's the one I remember. So it's always been, that's how I fell in love with the Bible, was that particular image and the story that went with it. And I said, wow. So I've spent my lifetime, hopefully properly studying the Bible, maybe clearly to my benefit, and maybe a little bit to yours. So this happens then, and David knows he's got to be careful. So Saul decides to send his agents over to David's house after he'd escaped the spear point, and bring him in and kill him. And he gets to the house, and the wife had figured out that my father's going to get you killed. Jump out the window and get out of here. And she makes up a pretend David in the bed and puts some goat hair on it to be his head. She said he's sick. He's in bed. And so finally Saul himself comes, and they look, and there's this fake thing, and he's mad at his daughter, and the daughter knows how to lie to him. Say, David threatened to kill me if I didn't do this and help him. So then they go after him, and he goes over and hide. David goes out to where an old Samuel is living in some huts in a place called Ramah, and so he hides there with Samuel. Saul hears about it. There's really no secrets in a community this size. And he sends his agents out, 2 groups of agents. They're each struck by a frenzy, F-R-E-N-Z-Y. Exactly what that frenzy is that incapacitates them as they get close to Samuel and David. And finally, Saul himself comes out to catch David. And he's struck by a frenzy also. And he falls to the ground and takes his clothes off and lies there naked. Now, this is the utter abomination in a culture like that, to see the king naked. It's an utter abomination. And he basically lies there all night. So it sounds to me like he had a grand mal seizure, classic epileptic seizure, because people are what's called post-ictal. They are sleepy, groggy for 24 hours or more. So that's what it sounds like there was. So this poor guy had all kinds of neurological problems. And then David flees and gets away. And then there's another episode where David's supposed to come back to court after this. And he's supposed to be resident there in the court. And there's a festival called the New Moon. And I'm not exactly certain what this festival was. We all know what the New Moon is. But a several-day festival, and David says, I can't go in there. This is too dangerous. Talking to Jonathan. And Jonathan says, I know what my father's going to do. He doesn't keep any secrets from me. I'll be able to find out if he's going to try to kill you or not. So David stays out the first day. And Saul notices he's not there, but figures, well, maybe he didn't get himself properly purified. Remember, these people had very strict purity laws about what you could do if you became impure, things you could go through to get purified, you would get contaminated by various things, etc., etc. So on the second night, he noticed he's not there. They had an interesting point that Saul is sitting in his usual seat with his back to the wall. Now, why would a monarch in an unstable kingdom want his back to the wall? So that nobody can come up behind him and stab him in the back or cut his throat. Because that's a good way to kill the king if you're one of the insiders like the general or the sons or whatever. It's interesting, even in the scriptures you have that type of description. I thought, well, that's an interesting way because clearly you want to do that because people are there's always somebody out to kill you in this circumstance. So Saul noticed he's not there, and Jonathan tries to cover for him. So, well, he's back at Bethlehem going to the family festival of this, and Saul gets enraged and calls him all sorts of nasty things, which are in there. You can read them in the text, but I'm not going to go over them. And Jonathan flees and goes out and warns David. And they had set up a situation where Jonathan could communicate where David is in hiding, whether it's safe to come in or whether it's not. Well, he shouted at this servant he sent out to retrieve some arrows, and he warns David, you're in great danger. And they hug each other, and David bows down to him 3 times, and they pledge their loyalty. This is a very important point because David remembers this. They pledge their loyalty to each other. And even if I die, you will take care of my family also. Each of them pledged that to the other. It turns out David actually has to do that. Jonathan gets killed later. And so it's a very important pledge to maintain their very close friendship. And then David is fleeing, and he goes to the priests of Nod. It's an interesting story that comes back later. He's got some men with him. He doesn't say how many. And they don't have any food because they're on the run, and this sacred temple has sanctified bread for use in the festivals for the Lord. And David says, I need something. What kind of food do you have? And they said, well, we just the sanctified bread. And David says, well, give it to me. And they do. And then David flees, and he runs to the Philistines. This is very interesting. He goes to the Philistines to get away from King Saul. And I'm certain other Hebrews had gone down and betrayed their people before. When we had the story about Saul's battle last time, that the Hebrews who had switched sides of the Philistines switched back, as I said. If you're betrayed one side, it's easy to betray the other. But he goes down to the Philistines to hide from Saul. And they say, hey, this is David. We know him. He's a dangerous guy. So then he has to pretend to be insane. It's a very interesting story. And they describe the various things he does to act like he's crazy. And, most cultures have strong prohibitions against killing the insane because they're not responsible for what they do. So even modern cultures, that's been persevered. It's been maintained that we don't execute people that are legally insane here. So that's how he's able to hide among the Philistines and survive. Now this is our stopping point. We're going to go through the next readings in which David ends up finally in charge. I know we're going through the material fairly in detail, but this is an important and fascinating story about human nature and God's will and the struggles that we have to find our role and maintain our role in life. So the readings for next week will be 1 Samuel chapters 22, 23, and 24, then chapters 26, 27, 28, 29, and chapter 31, then the first chapter of 2 Samuel. At that point, David will end up in control, and then we'll have a couple more lessons on David because he has great successes and then great traumas. So it's a fascinating story. This is Dr. Guthrie. Thank you for your time and attention. It's been a pleasure.